It took me longer than I expected to admit that leaving didn't make everything lighter. I had imagined freedom would feel like a clean breath, but instead, it came with a quiet weight I didn't know how to name at first. My name is Eliza. I was raised in an old order Amish community in Pennsylvania, and I left a few years ago. When people hear that, they often picture a single dramatic break and then a straight path into a new life. What they don't see is the long middle stretch where you're out but not yet settled anywhere inside yourself. That's the place I lived in for a long time. I grew up with clear lines around my life. There were rules for how we dressed, how we spoke, how we worked, and how we believed. Those rules weren't cruel. Most of the time, they were comforting. They told me who I was without me having to ask the question. Leaving meant those answers were suddenly gone, and what surprised me most was how much effort it took to replace them. There's an assumption that once Amish women leave, the hardest part is over. The thinking is that the restrictions are gone, so the struggle must end there. That idea misses something important. The struggle doesn't stop, it changes shape. Instead of rules pressing in from the outside, there's a steady pressure from within, a kind of disorientation that shows up in ordinary moments. One of the first things I struggled with was how quiet my days became in a different way. In the community, silence was shared. Even when no one spoke, you knew where you belonged. After I left, silence felt personal. I remember sitting alone in a small rented room, listening to traffic outside, realizing no one knew where I was or what I was doing. That freedom felt heavy, not because I wanted supervision, but because I had never learned how to carry myself without it. There's a belief in Amish life that obedience brings peace. It's taught gently, often through example rather than words. When you follow the Ordnung, life may be limited, but it's stable. That belief exists to protect unity and faith, to keep the community from fracturing under too many individual choices. When you leave, you don't just leave rules. You leave the structure that told you your choices were good enough because they were approved. I remember my first job outside the community. I stood in front of a shelf of work shoes, staring at dozens of options. It sounds small, but I felt my chest tighten. Back home, there was one kind of shoe for work. You didn't decide, you accepted. I stood there so long that an employee asked if I needed help. I nodded, embarrassed by how something so simple had become complicated. I bought a pair at random and cried in my car afterward, not because of the shoes, but because I felt unprepared for a world that expected me to know myself. Another moment stays with me from early on. I was invited to a casual dinner by someone I worked with. She asked what foods I liked. I opened my mouth and nothing came out right away. I knew what foods I was allowed to eat growing up. I knew what we served on Sundays and holidays. But liking something for myself felt like a different question. I laughed it off and said I wasn't picky, but later that night I lay awake thinking about how much of my life had been shaped by usefulness instead of preference. The community pressure doesn't end just because you leave. It becomes quieter, more distant, but it's still there. Sometimes it comes as a letter from family, written in careful, loving language, reminding you of prayer. Sometimes it's silence, which can be heavier than words. You learn quickly that your choices are still being weighed, even if you're no longer present to hear the judgment directly. Emotionally, the hardest part was learning to trust my own feelings. In my upbringing, feelings were acknowledged but not centered. You learn to endure discomfort as part of faith. After leaving, when sadness or anxiety came up, I didn't know what to do with it. I kept waiting for someone to tell me how to handle it correctly. When no one did, I assumed I was failing. I want to be clear that not every Amish woman experiences life this way, either before or after leaving. Some women find deep peace within the community and never feel the need to step outside it. Others leave and adjust quickly, finding confidence and stability in new ways. My experience is one story among many, shaped by my personality as much as my past. What I struggled with most after leaving was learning to make decisions alone. In the Amish world, decisions are shared. Even personal choices are guided by family, church leaders, and long-standing custom. That shared responsibility can feel restrictive, but it also cushions you. When I was suddenly responsible for every outcome in my life, I felt exposed. I remember standing in a doctor's office, being asked to choose a treatment option. The doctor explained the differences and then waited. I realized no one was going to tell me which one was right. My hands shook as I signed the form. Walking back to my car, I felt proud and terrified at the same time. The pride came from choosing. The fear came from knowing the consequences were mine alone. This struggle showed up in relationships too. I was used to clear roles and expectations. Outside the community, everything felt negotiable. That flexibility is a gift, but it can also feel unstable when you've never practiced it. I worried constantly about making the wrong choice, about choosing something that would reveal how unprepared I was. Over time, I began to see that this uncertainty wasn't a flaw. It was a skill I hadn't learned yet. Just like sewing or cooking for a large family, decision-making takes practice. No one had taught me how to weigh options based on my own needs and values. I had to learn slowly, often by making small mistakes and sitting with the discomfort they brought. There were days when I missed the certainty of my old life deeply, not because I wanted to go back, but because certainty is comforting. On those days, I reminded myself that growth often feels like loss before it feels like gain. I learned to celebrate small choices made with confidence, even if they seemed ordinary to others. As time passed, the weight I felt began to shift. It didn't disappear, but it became more familiar. I started to recognize my own voice when it spoke up, even quietly. I learned that struggling didn't mean I had made the wrong decision by leaving. It meant I was doing something new without a map. If you've left a community, or a belief system, or even a version of yourself that once felt safe, you might recognize some of this. The struggle after leaving isn't a sign of weakness. It's often a sign that you're learning how to live without borrowed certainty. I'm still learning. Some days are easier than others, but I've come to understand that the challenges I faced after leaving were not punishments. They were invitations to know myself in a way I never had before. If any part of my experience sounds familiar to you, you're not alone, even if it feels that way sometimes.